the world's most volatile region than any other political bloc. It's a pleasure to have many good friends in the audience, and I do want to recognize our board chair, Joe Gildenhorn, as well as members of the Wilson Council, the Wilson National Cabinet, and our Wilson Alliance members in attendance. For those of you new to the Wilson Center, how is that possible? Let me add a few words on the center itself. Congress created us in 1968 with a view to honoring President Wilson with a living memorial rather than another statue or monument on the mall. Wilson was our only president to have earned a PhD. In his day, he was a leading political scientist before becoming president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and a two-term president. The center brings together two passions of Wilson's life by aligning scholarship with good policy, something that no longer seems to happen about a mile from here. I hope the irony is not lost on you that the Wilson Center, named for a president who happened to be a member of the Democratic Party, is housed in the Reagan Building. Again, I only wish we had more of that kind of bipartisanship nearby. Our charter forbids us from advocacy, but not from creating a platform that I have come to call a safe political space to engage a diversity of views to explore the toughest issues. We started our national conversations a year ago. Our aim is to provide a space where we can discuss domestic and foreign policy issues in a nonpartisan atmosphere and to look for solutions. Today's conversation, as you all know, deals with one of the most pressing issues that the United States faces. The United States embraced the aspirations of those who inspired the Arab awakening, and it condemned the use of force against demonstrators in Tunisia, Yemen, Libya, Bahrain, and Egypt, just as it condemns the continuing violence against Syrian demonstrators today. More later about that issue. Fundamental changes taking place in the Middle East and North Africa, and all of us who have followed developments for years never thought that octogenarian rulers would ever give up power. Few would have predicted the pace of change in 16 months with the end of leaders in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya. At the same time, few foresaw that from these upheavals, Islamic parties would emerge as the leading players in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and the Islamists would be a noticeable presence in the parliaments of Kuwait and Morocco as well. More later. These parties, long operating underground or semi-clandestinely, are now in power or coming to power, and that requires addressing the fundamental problems of governance, creating jobs, dealing with corruption, encouraging investment, managing foreign policy, and answering a universal demand for representative government and better standards of living. Some of that's actually going on in this country as well, I might point out. How will these parties handle their new responsibilities? That is a question that over the last few months has been a focus of our attention at the Wilson Center. I was in Tunisia as an official observer of that election, and I would conclude that that one maybe uniquely went extremely well, and it is impressive to see what the government, an Islamist-dominated government, has been saying, and to visit with them here at the Wilson Center recently, and to see that women have retained an important role. Again, there will be a discussion of that on this panel. I want to just cut through this, but also to say that we continue to have meetings as recently as this morning with parliamentarians from the UAE, where's Hala, or business leaders from the UAE, women discussing how things are going, and we continue to build something called the Council of Women World Leaders, which is the group of women who head countries around the world. 20 now do, 53 have over time, and 47 of them belong to this group. We continue to assess how women's roles in leadership are going. Robin Wright is the supremely qualified editor of this volume. She has spent years in the region. She was the first to recognize and to lay out in her book, Rock, the Casbah, which won what prize? No, it didn't win it. It won my prize. That a new generation, it's the Jane Award, with new voices was emerging to challenge the old order in a serious way. The book was written, in part, at the Wilson Center. Robin will now give introductory remarks and take part in the panel, but I do want to just mention briefly that the panelists are current and former Wilson Center Fellows, and they include Nathan Brown, Samer Shahada, David Ottaway, and obviously Robin. You have their bios, so I won't go on about that. But we're also thrilled that today's session is moderated by Steve Inskeep, the host of NPR's Morning Edition, the most widely heard radio news program in the United States, and also heard every morning in the Harmon household. Steve has traveled across the nation and around the world for Morning Edition NPR News, including to Iran. From the Persian Gulf to the wreckage of New Orleans, he has interviewed presidents, warlords, authors, musicians, as well as those not in the headlines, and it's a pleasure to have him with us. Let me now call on Robin to start us off. And finally, I said this to Steve Inskeep just before. It's very strange to see an actual person with that radio voice. I can't quite believe he's a live person. So here's your book back.
Thank you so much.
And please welcome Robin Wright.
Thank you very much. I have 5 minutes to wrap up the entire book so that we can then go to the most important part, and that's the panel discussion. I need, of course, to thank very much the Woodrow Wilson Center and the U.S. Institute of Peace for pulling together what was an extraordinary and timely project in a very, very short period of time, and we're very proud of the product. It tries to restore a bit of sanity to what has been an often hysterical debate and one of the most controversial in foreign policy. What I thought I'd do is give you some of the bullet point headlines in the book. One of them is that in 14 countries, we've identified over 50 Islamist parties and pro-Islamist groups that have redefined the agenda. And in many ways, the toppling of geriatric autocrats was only a very small part of what's happened in the last 16 months. Just as important for the future of the region is really the emergence of these very parties. Half of them were only formed in the last 10 years, and 10 of the 50 were only formed in the last year. So some of these are really brand new to the project. Islamist parties have created a whole new spectrum. This is excluding the militant groups, and they fall into three broad categories. One of the classical or traditional Islamists, for whom implementing Islamic law is a fundamental goal, and they will do that. They want to do that in writing new constitutions and in passing new legislation. The second category are the neo-Islamists, for whom Islam is in many ways a set of values by which to define your agenda. They are not about making sure that every piece of legislation is in keeping with the sacred texts going back 14 centuries. But they are about blending Islam and democracy in a very vibrant way. And then you have the post-Islamists who separate their political and religious discourse, but for whom Islam defines their broader objectives. And then there's the fourth category, and these are the newest in the political arena, and those are the Salafis. And they have their own category, too. It's amazing, this labyrinth of Islamist politics. You have the scientific Salafis, the scholarly Salafis, who are merge around one cleric. And one of the things about the Salafis is that they are kind of naive, clumsy, and new to political organization. They tend to come from gatherings around a certain sheikh, and they've only pooled their resources in a place like Egypt at the very last minute. But you also have the Costa Salafis, as we like to call them, who are named after a coffee shop where the young Salafis like to hang out, and they don't always agree with the older generation. And that's another bottom line, and that is that the very forces, the young, who were so pivotal in challenging the autocrats, are just as important in challenging the geriatric leadership of the Islamist movements. And you have the young who, it's the largest baby boom proportionally in the world, and it will be in that region for the next 30 or 40 years, because this baby boom, now in their 20s and early 30s, is going to move through the system because there are now declining birth rates in many of these countries. And so they are going to continue, just like my generation in the United States, to define the political agenda. Now, the interesting thing is that many of these Islamist groups, since being elected, are under pressure to deal much more with reality than religion. And the reality is jobs, jobs, jobs. And the economic agenda is in many ways as important and potentially even more defining in terms of what comes next and will they succeed. And the Islamists take very different positions on what will work. They are, many of them, for private enterprise and capitalism, but they are also all about social justice. And that's a real hard match to make. And trying to figure out how you create jobs and you also continue to provide or improve on basic social services will be one of the defining forces. It was very interesting to me when I went to see one of the members of the Noor Party, the Salafi group that won about a quarter of the vote in Egypt in January, how when I asked them who their models were, they pointed to former Brazilian President Lula, a socialist, because he had led Brazil into becoming the 8th largest economic power in the world. And that struck me. When they're not looking at the likes of Ayatollah Khomeini or Said Qutb or some of the older names in Islamic politics, they're looking for who can make it in the early 21st century. I'm running out of my 5 minutes. I have so many other points to make. I think on foreign policy, one of the things that will be tough, we will have very tense relations with all of these Islamist groups, I think, in the initial phase. They look at what's happened from a very different perspective than we have. We look at the region as drifting towards Islamism, and they see this as finally making the break with colonialism. And they think this is the moment that they are seizing control of their future. And a lot of them really want to back away from issues of foreign aid, foreign influence, even decisively. They may take aid short term, but they're all talking about how can they not be reliant on the outside world because they don't want, at the end of the day, to have to compromise on issues that are important to them. I think there are important social issues that are going to be tough. I think the next decade is likely to be tough on women. They were at the forefront of every single demonstration, every protest movement in the region. In many countries, they actually organized their own. But they have not fared well. And among the Salafis in Egypt, for example, the women candidates were not allowed to show their pictures in campaign literature or on the ballot. They had to use flowers or the campaign logo. And on the issue that's often most controversial in discussing Islamists when it comes to what they intend to do next is the issue of their regional relations. And it's pretty clear to me that while they use scathing language about Israel, that at the same time there's not a single Islamist party that wants another war with Israel. They think that era has passed. They don't think they can afford it politically or financially. The militaries also don't want it either. And so anyway, the bottom line is I think we're entering a fifth phase with this Islamist, the rise of the Islamist parties today, fifth phase since the Muslim Brotherhood was formed in 1928. I think we're due to go through many more phases down the road because they have a lot of evolution, a long way to go to evolve into a way that works comfortably with the rest of the world. But I think that the past year has been a beginning, and I think that's how we all need to look at it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Robin, and congratulations on the book. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be talking with these folks, some of whose bylines I've looked for, some of whose advice I have relied upon when traveling in the region. And it's great to see this room full of knowledge. We're going to begin the discussion up here, and then we'll invite you to join it as we go along. And I'm glad that people are watching in their homes and offices as well via the web. Let me pick up on something that you said, Robin Wright. You said that you are trying to restore a bit of sanity to what I think you said is an often hysterical debate in this country. Why do you call it so?
Well, I think that we're still locked in many ways in the mentality of whether it's the hostage ordeal from the Iranian Revolution in 1979 or the marine bombing in Beirut. I mean, the wave of suicide bombings that began in the 1980s, which at least a couple of us in this room covered. and the post 9/11 world, that we tend to see the word Islamism and read extremism, and that makes us all vulnerable when many in the region are actually moving way beyond that.
I'm wondering if there's a comparison to be made to the Cold War, especially the early phases of the Cold War, when this country was deeply concerned about communism, had excellent reasons to be concerned about communism, but history shows made the mistake of assuming that communism meant the same thing everywhere. Is that a fair comparison to what you're talking about?
I think there is that kind of paranoia and the kind of simplistic assessment of who these people are. Communism was, I mean, there are a lot of differences because we're talking about it just in the Arab world, 22 countries, 300 million people, and there are 1.5 billion people who are Muslims in the world. And the Islamic world is no longer contained just to certain countries. We have the largest Islamic, it's the second fastest growing religion, fastest growing religion in this country and the second largest. Whether it's Trinidad and Tobago or among Aborigines in Australia, you find that Islam is a growing force. So it's hard to compare it to one country that created its own empire. But I do think that the kind of human sentiment, that fear factor, is very similar to the Cold War.
I want to invite our other panelists to join the discussion, but let me just ask you one more thing that gets to the heart of what you're talking about when you're talking about complexity. You mentioned briefly the Costa Salafis. Now, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, Costa coffee is like Starbucks-like in Cairo. I mean, there's a bunch of Costa, so it would be like having Starbucks Salafis, basically, sitting around in this corporate chain talking about Islam, but they've got this name Salafi, which is the scariest of all the possible names you could have. How do the people talking in the coffee shops understand that they're integrating a lot of different ideas, or are they actually integrating a lot of different ideas?
Great question, and I think that to me, the diversity among the Islamists is maybe the most important factor. That the old argument used to be, are Islam and democracy compatible? And in many ways, they are now interdependent in the Middle East, particularly, but elsewhere as well. And that neither one is going to survive much, or develop without the other. That
no, keep going.
No. And so when you talk about the young Salafis, they're not as interested in the rigidity of the older generation. They may wear the baggy pants and have the untrimmed beards, but they'll also...
Do they order double lattes?
But they order double lattes and they wear, Nikes or, the latest sporting shoes and shiny sunglasses, designer sunglasses. So they are part of the 21st century, and that's one thing I think that between whether it's the technology and the internet, the access to the outside world, whether it's global trade patterns, the economic realities, many of them are very good businessmen among the Islamists, that they understand what's happening in the world. And part of the reason they've demanded change is because they want to be part of it.
Samar Shahada, are Islamists or some of the more conservative Islamists part of the 21st century, or is it just the clothes and the coffee?
No, I think that even among the most conservative Islamists, they are very much living in the 21st century. And of course, we're talking here about, and Robin has said, and I think this is the most important point, the diversity of the Islamist spectrum. And so here we're talking about Islamists who largely participate in formal politics and participate in elections. Even those who don't do those things and who think that elections and democracy are a Western anti-Islamic creation, even those Islamists are very much living in the 21st century. Whether they're making improvised explosive devices or using the internet as a vehicle to recruit adherents, they're also living in the 21st century. But Robin's point about diversity in the Salafis, I think, is right on. And it's also a point that was made for Egyptians, because if we in this country, or in the West, quote unquote, more generally, have a stereotype impression of Islamists as, long beards and living in the 7th century and so on, in Egypt, where the Costa Salafis are, the impression or the stereotype of Salafis there are these backward 7th century strict religious ultra-conservative Islamists. And I think that the Costa Salafis actually get that point across, that even among Salafism, the most conservative form of Islamism, there's a great deal of diversity. Those who participate in politics, those who think that elections are anathema. And we only need to go to Kuwait to know that Salafis in Kuwait have participated in elections and politics for quite some time. And I'm motioning to Nathan because he's worked on Kuwait, and their Salafis in some senses were more ahead of Salafism in Egypt.
Go right ahead, Nathan Brown.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what I would say is, to be fair to the stereotype for just a second, there is something about Salafism that makes people think it's hearkening back to the 7th century. That's what, in a sense, Salafis say they're doing. They're going back to the original practice of the Prophet in the early community in order to discover how it is that they should dress, how they should talk, what phrases they should use, and so forth and so on.
That's the stated goal. Yeah.
Absolutely. But they're certainly very much operating within a 21st century environment, even as they're trying to draw on those practices. And that's true in a political sense as well. There are some countries, Kuwait and Bahrain are among them, where Salafis have been politically active for a long time, trying to figure out how to pass legislation, even trying to figure out how to build coalitions with people across the political spectrum, even people on the left, sometimes even dealing with women parliamentarians and so forth and so on. And then there are the newer ones, like in Egypt, where Salafis have traditionally basically created their own self-contained communities. Now they're going out and trying to get votes. And so if you look at a place like that, there's this uneasy, or I would say kind of sudden adjustment that they have to make from speaking within their own ranks to addressing the broader public. There are Salafis elsewhere in the Arab world who have a long experience doing this.
Well, you talked about Salafis going out to get votes. Let me ask about something that is commonly said here in the United States, has been said by senior diplomats as well as people on the street, that sure, Islamists are in favor of democracy now. And Robin, you used the word interdependent. They're interdependent with democracy now. Sure, they're in favor of it now, it is said. But once they win an election, it will be the final election. Is there any truth to that? Anyone? Robin, go ahead.
Look, it's really interesting that in the countries, Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt, that no party has won an outright majority. And in Tunisia, they have agreed to work together with two Islamic parties to form, or two secular parties to form a government. In Egypt, the two Islamist parties, which together won 70% of the seats in parliament, are rivals to each other. I was struck when I went to see the members of the Muslim Brotherhood how they would criticize the Salafis as being naive and extreme. And then the Salafis would say, oh, the Muslim Brotherhood, they've compromised their principles. They're not really Islamists anymore. And this is what's so interesting. It's not just the diversity within, it's the fact that they are competing against each other in some cases more than they're even competing with the secularists.
Al-Aswani, a name that'll be familiar to many people in this room, excellent Egyptian author, argued on our program sometime last year, I believed, that although there was concern about Islamists, that he believed that their contact with government, their contact with power, would be corrective because, he argued, that they would be forced to deliver services to people or they would be thrown out of office. People are nodding. You believe that hypothesis. You buy that hypothesis.
I certainly do.
I mean, you really see it. To me, the Salafis and even the Muslim Brotherhood, it's like a gigantic coming out party. And what they're faced with is tough economic realities. And they're all for social justice. Well, that's fine. But if you have workers who are demanding an increase in the minimum wage, that are going on strikes, that are disrupting the economy, whose side are you on if you're in government or you have to deal with stabilizing these economies? So you're getting Salafis and Muslim Brotherhood parties really challenged by the facts on the ground and how that squares with their theories of social justice. And they're really, it's a very quick learning experience. But they are learning, and it's fascinating to watch them do this.
Theories of social justice, because they are coming at it, some of them anyway, from a point of view of they don't just want to impose rules, they want to actually help people who need help. That's what you're saying.
Well, and many of them were born out of social movements that they, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, but this is true of Hamas and many of the others, that they were the ones that provided, whether it was cheap or free health care, welfare services, schooling, things that the state couldn't provide or couldn't provide in any quality form. And so they tapped into their own membership to make sure that people, doctors who in their after hours would come and provide health care. And so that's really important. But the interesting thing is the degree to which they're facing challenges now from labor unions. You know, we pay a lot of attention when there are protests on the streets demanding political change, but what's happened over the past year is this extraordinary array of labor strikes that are saying whether it's we want better wages or we want to just be paid, or you know, this is what the Tunisian party that won the election has been facing over the past month.
But let me ask, just coming back to that question, that fear that if they win an election, it's the last election. Do you believe in the countries where you currently have Islamists that have won some share of power, in a couple of cases in actual elections, that they are committed to democracy, and even if they were to win a majority at some point, they would stay with the democratic system?
I think most definitely. I mean, if we look at the countries where Islamists have participated in elections recently and won after the so-called Arab Spring, that includes Tunisia, of course, and the Nahda Party, Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, Morocco, which had its own version of the Arab Spring, and the PJD, the Party of Justice and Development. In the case of all three parties, they have been participating in elections now in Tunisia and in Egypt since the late 1980s, mid-1980s in Egypt, and in the case of Morocco since the 1990s. They've consistently participated in elections. I think they've learned from that. I think they're committed to the electoral process and democracy. So the question is no longer, and I really think it never has been, really, Islam and democracy. The question is, to what extent will Islamists produce liberal democracy? Liberal democracy meaning not only elections that are repeated and so on and rotation of power, but a democracy that includes full citizenship for everyone in these countries, women, religious minorities, and so on. I think that's the question, and that's what we're going to have to see work out in the coming period.
Robin Wright, in her opening remarks, suggested some doubt on that score. She specifically mentioned women. She's expecting a very hard time for women over the next decade.
I agree. I think that women, and not only over the last decade, over the last number of decades in the Middle East and elsewhere, of course, and that tells us that this issue is not simply one that is limited to Islamists, right? Even before the January 25 revolution, quote unquote, in Egypt, the ruling party and the supposed liberal opposition parties had a miserable record with regard to nominating women candidates to run in elections and so on. So there certainly are those concerns, and that diversity with regard to politics is also found with regard to women. So Robin mentioned that the Salafis were reluctant. They kind of grudgingly put women on their party lists when they were forced to by law. And when they did, they always appeared at the very end of the list, and they never had women candidates have their pictures on the campaign material or even engage in campaigning. Well, the Brotherhood was different. The Brotherhood had a number of women. Well, first of all, they've been running women in parliamentary elections since 2000. And they had a number of women who were number 2, number 3 on the ballot, campaigning better than the men. So even among the Islamists, there's a great deal of diversity on this issue.
The Muslim Brotherhood actually has a sisterhood.
The Muslim Sisterhood?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's of long standing as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Ottaway.
On this issue, I'm a bit more skeptical. You can be committed to democracy in principle and in theory, but if you don't have countervailing forces in your political system to force you to be democratic, I think the general tendency will always be to consolidate power and become less democratic. Now, what's really good about Tunisia is there are so many countervailing forces. The Islamists only have 40, in Nahda, the party there only has 40% of the vote. They're forced to work in a coalition with 2 secular parties. In Egypt, you now have the military as a countervailing force. You have the courts coming out as more independent body. So you have countervailing forces, which really forces you to be democratic, whether you believe it or don't believe it. So I think democracy, it's not the theory of it, it's what forces you to become democratic.
Well, you said you're skeptical. You're saying that you think, given the chance, your average Islamist party would tend toward greater and greater consolidation of power.
I do.
But I think David's making the point that's more general among politics everywhere, not just in the Middle East.
Right.
Yeah, and you have to be careful about talking about your average Islamic party because, that's not always, there isn't really.
That's the danger you're warning against to begin with.
Yeah, they're all different, and they all have their different relationships with Western ideas. They all have their different minority issues, their different experience leading up to it. I mean, in Egypt, the women did poorly in part because it was the military that eliminated the 10% quota of a guaranteed number of seats for women in parliament. It wasn't the Islamists that did that.
Let's continue to look at some of the diversity and the gradations here. Let's run down our panel. We have people who are experts on different countries. And Samar Shahadas, let's start with you. If you just drill down on Egypt, what are a few factors in Egypt that make it unique, that distinguish it from other countries that have been involved in the Arab Spring?
Well, I mean, you know, as Robin mentioned, a number of these Islamist parties are quite new. In Egypt, you have the mother of all Islamist organizations, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has a history dating back to 1928. And in fact, the founder of the movement, Hassan al-Banna himself, stood in parliamentary elections early on. So I think the history of the movement, the weight of the movement, the organizational depth, the discipline of the movement is something I think that is different than some other states, not all of them, but some of the other states. The diversity is also there. I mean, the spectrum goes from the most ultra-conservative Salafis to the post-Islamist types and so on. So the diversity is certainly there. I think what differentiates Egypt maybe from Tunisia is certainly the role of the military. The military is still a major player in a non-democratic fashion, I should say. So that's certainly something that differentiates Egypt from Tunisia.
And let's continue on to another country, a country where the Arab Spring, as I recall, on a single day amounted to one guy who showed up for a planned demonstration in Saudi Arabia. And David Ottaway, this is a country that you know very well. We can't talk about a lot of political reform in Saudi Arabia, but we can talk about some or talk about the appearance of it. What's happening there and how does it relate to what's happening elsewhere?
Well, Saudi Arabia is unique. Islamists have been in power in Saudi Arabia for 268 years, since 1744, when they struck a deal between Islamic reformer Muhammad al-Wahhab and Muhammad al-Saud, the ruling family. So these two forces, these two groups have been, had a duopoly of power in Saudi Arabia, on and off, not because this is actually the third Saudi kingdom that's in power now. But anyway, they've been in power for many, many decades. And the issue there now is reducing the Islamic influence over society. So it's kind of where the Arab world might be, or the number of countries that are now becoming more Islamic may be in another 10 years or 20 years, where there's going to be a feeling there's too much Islamic influence and there's going to be kind of an attempt to roll it back. Well, in Saudi Arabia, the liberals are trying to do this, but the Arab Spring has had the effect of reconsolidating this alliance between the religious establishment and the ruling al-Saud family.
For self-defense, in effect.
For self-defense. And they are totally against democracy, and they're doing everything to stop any display of interest in democracy, down to the point of not allowing any demonstrations. And the one guy who showed up on March 13th, the so-called Day of Rage, he is still in prison today.
I'm impressed that we can even know where he is at this point. Now that raises a lot of compelling points, but let me drop that for the moment. Let me just move on to another subject here, if I can. Let's bring in Nathan Brown at this point. You have focused on the Palestinians, which in many ways is a special case. If you talk about Arabs, how do they fit into this picture?
Well, they're special, for better or worse, I would say, in two ways. First, of all the movements that we're talking about, this is the one that still has an armed wing. Most of the other movements that we're talking about have said long ago, we'll follow the rules. The rules may be tilted against us. We want to change the rules or whatever, but we will follow the rules. We'll work within the system. And Hamas has basically, I mean, quite literally, resistance is its middle name. It is the movement of Islamic resistance. And they say they will not give that up. That is a strategic option. So they're different from the others. They say all of our resistance is outward oriented. It's oriented towards Israel. It's not to, it's not to use against Palestinians. That said, to me, what is very interesting is that since the election victory of Hamas in 2006, even though they say we're a resistance movement, they've become much more political and much more about governing and much more deeply entrenched in governing Gaza, which they now control, than you would think for a movement that is ideologically committed to being sort of outward oriented. The second thing that is interesting about them, that is, I would say, unusual about them, is that the question that we've just been debating, what happens if they win? Well, this happened to them in 2006. They won. And from the perspective of the Islamist movement, including Hamas, what happened was the world came down on them, other Palestinians came down on them, financial assistance was cut off, they were boycotted, and this sort of thing. The president, Abu Mazen, who was from the rival Fatah movement, threatened to disband the parliament and so forth and so on. So the lesson that they learned a little bit was, everybody's cheating against us. But what's interesting is how Islamists in other countries talk about that. Of course, they say the same thing. Yes, it's the world and other Palestinians were unfair to Hamas, but we have to learn a lesson from that. And a lot of the hesitant behavior that you see of other Islamist movements is they're trying to figure out what will the international system bear, what will domestic politics bear, and they will very explicitly say, we're never going to make the same mistake Hamas did of winning the first time, winning too quickly.
When they want to delay until the time is right to be in power.
A lot of, we can hear from Semra on this. In the Egyptian case, their constant back and forth. Are we running? We're not running. We're running for 30%, 40%. A lot of it is looking at Hamas.
Is that part of the backstory of why the Muslim Brotherhood, at least at first, said we're not going to run candidates everywhere?
That's completely correct, and Nathan has written about this too. And Islamists in the past have been running elections intentionally to lose, or at least not to win as much as they could in Morocco, in Egypt, and elsewhere. And that's because they don't want to frighten the international community, certainly the United States, and they also don't want to frighten the local population that they're in it for power. Of course, the game has changed now. Now the game has changed. Now Ben Ali and Mubarak are no longer there to, by repression, make sure that they don't win. But certainly, the Muslim Brotherhood's initial statements that they were only going to compete for 30% of the parliamentary seats and then only 50% of the parliamentary seats and then not nominate a presidential candidate, and now they have two, or at least one after they've been. All of those were sincere statements at the time based on this old logic of political participation, but they've realized the game's changed.
Well, the new logic of democracy, of competition, has forced them to go back on that, hasn't it?
That's exactly right. Now, it's not bad to win. And the game has changed, and, it's quite banal, but they're a political party like any other, and they want power and they want influence.
We should remember, and I don't wish to oversimplify, but Hosni Mubarak's regime was not seen as friendly to Hamas. How have things changed now that the government has changed in Egypt for the Palestinians?
Not that much for the short term. The question is really the long term. Right now, in a sense, in terms of foreign policy and security policy, the old regime is basically still there in place, holdovers from it. But you're looking at an Islamist-dominated parliament and an Islamist movement that I think sees itself as focusing first on domestic politics, but ultimately moving outwards and having an interest in foreign and security policy. That said, I think there's a sense still kind of trying to figure out what is it that the world will bear. And they figured out fairly quickly that the relationship with Israel really matters an awful lot to the United States. And so this is an issue I think that they have tried to postpone. And they've tried, I think, in Egypt to send gentle signals to their little brothers in Hamas. This is not the time to push this issue right now. And Hamas seems to have picked up that signal that they're very confident, I think, long term, that a rising trend of Islam in the region will somehow benefit them in some way, shape, or form. But they're willing to wait.
I actually saw the Muslim Brotherhood delegation when they came through town 2 weeks ago, and the member of parliament from Luxor, as well as the foreign policy coordinator for the the Freedom and Justice Party, which is the name of the Muslim Brotherhood Party, talked quite openly about how they think that there's a greater chance for peace now than there ever was because they can exert the pressure with credibility. Hamas is an offshoot of the Brotherhood, and that they want peace. It's not in their interests to have a war, and they think they can get a little bit more than the Mubarak regime, but the mere fact that they're talking about peace with Israel, that they use the word Israel, is to me striking when you consider that Anwar Sadat was killed after making peace with Israel by a radical Islamist in 1981.
It seems to me there's a couple of ways for me as a layman to interpret what you have said, slightly different things. If I'm trying to think about this from the Israeli point of view, you might say Israel doesn't need to worry as much as they thought they did, or you might say Israel doesn't need to worry that much right now. Which is more correct?
Probably right now, but I think that, again, nobody wants another war. They haven't really had a conventional war now since '73. I mean, this is, with a government anyway. They've had it with, whether it's the Palestinians in Lebanon or Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza. But the idea of a conventional war, they know they can't win. And they know that the international community will not, that they jeopardize a lot, that there are costs that they can't incur at a time they need in a globalizing world.
Well, I think one of the key issues with regard to Israel also is that with regard to Israel's relationship with Egypt, for example, or we can also say Jordan, in the past they have had relations with one individual or one regime that has not been beholden to popular wishes, to the will of the people, as it were. And so certainly having to take into consideration that their actions are going to be met with an Egyptian foreign policy that has to pass muster with the electorate, as it were. I think that changes the regional calculation, and it changes the regional balance of power as well, in the interests of the Palestinians in that sense.
Let me ask something, because we just talked about the way that political competition caused the Muslim Brotherhood to change their positions on something. As we all know, in any political system, you can have a situation, and it especially is true when something really emotional like religion is invoked. Political parties will compete by arguing that they're just a little more religious than the other guy. They're just a little more pure in whatever ideology you're following than the other guy. And then you have a leapfrog of the other party coming back and saying, actually, no, I'm a little more pure than you are.
Doesn't happen here at all.
Never, never. It's nothing. That's why I'm explaining it so clearly, because it would never happen in the United States in any way whatsoever. It's happened in almost any political system you could study. And I wonder, as there is a competition between religious parties for the votes of the faithful masses, if you over time will have more and more hardline positions that become more prominent. Is that a real danger? Go ahead, Robin.
I think the Muslim Brotherhood's under a lot of pressure from the Salafis, and the emergence of the first Salafi kind of factions or cells in Tunisia has begun to change the thinking. But what happens is that you get the Salafis on one side, and then you get the old secular elites on the other, and they start to polarize. And in Tunisia, for example, the media is still under the control predominantly of the secular elite from before, and they're broadcasting all kinds of things that have varying degrees of truth about whether it's the Ennahda party, which means Renaissance, or about the Salafis. And so the Ennahda party says, well, maybe we didn't want a press law, but maybe we need one just to protect ourselves because we don't have a media outlet. And the Salafis say that we have to do more about instituting Islam because that's the only way to protect ourselves. So that there are all these polarizing factors right now that make it particularly tough. And there will be that rivalry over how do we make sure the system is fair, because it's not going to be fair for a long time to come.
Do the guys who are a little more extreme have an edge in this kind of political competition?
They don't have an edge, but they're more aggressive. What you see in Tunisia in particular is that they're really in your face. They're going and attacking secularists that are having their own demonstrations on Avenue Bourguiba, which is the equivalent of Tahrir Square in Tunis. and they're calling for the niqab, women wearing face veils, and they've tied up one university just outside of Tunis, where they even took down the Tunisian flag and raised the black Salafi flag. And they're insisting that students that wear the niqab can go on the campus, not only go on the campus, but go in the classroom and take exams with these face veils. And there are only 6 of them in this one university, but they have tied up the university for 3 months over this issue because the administration doesn't want to allow women with niqab on the campus. So they are very aggressive, and they're sort of in your face, and they're not hiding their agenda, at least in Tunisia.
This is the Salafis.
This is the Salafis. And it's really, I think it's really important that the Ennahda and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt stand up and say, you know, this is going too far. You can't force people, you can't be intolerant. It's fine to be, you know, freedom of dress, etc., but you can't be intolerant against people who don't want to wear it. And they're trying to force women to wear it.
Well, the Tunisian Ennahda party, actually, the founder of it, came out about 3 weeks ago and said, we are not going to have Sharia in the Constitution. Our Constitution under the previous regime said we are Arab and Muslim as a nation, and we think that's enough, and that we don't need to talk about Sharia in the Constitution. And that, you know, was a direct response to the pressures of the Salafis.
I want to mention that in a couple of minutes I'm going to invite your questions. I'm going to invite you to join this discussion so you can be preparing those. And at the end of this discussion, I'll warn our panelists we're going to have a kind of lightning round, and you guys will have something to say at the end that is even more brilliant than what you've already said. But I want to ask about something that has been said by every regime on its way down in one way or another, and is being said by regimes that have yet to fall. Be very afraid of who will be in charge of this country, or if no one will be in charge of this country when we go. And that has certainly been said of the rulers of Syria at the moment. And let me turn the discussion to Syria. Should we be worried about what on earth happens in Syria if and when the Assad regime goes?
I'm happy to take it, but I also defer to my colleagues. I think that the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria is likely to do better than anybody else. Maybe not a majority again, maybe a plurality like has happened elsewhere. The danger is that the longer the Syrian conflict goes on, there are so many different factions within the country, whether it's sectarian, ethnic factions, and then you also have the opposition, which is broken up into different factions and is squabbling among itself about who controls whether it's the Syrian National Council, which is largely exiles, or the local coordinating committees, which are the people on the ground who are trying, basically in individual cities or regions, trying just to keep account of the dead and organize local protests. And then you have the Syrian, the Free Syrian Army, which is made up of defectors, anywhere from, we've got estimates from, 17 to 25,000, which I think is probably very high, but who don't have any arms and they use whatever they can take with them when they leave the army, or what few things they can sneak across the border. And these guys can't get together. And there is that danger, as someone who covered the Iranian Revolution, that you find Islam is the one force that will unite the disparate opposition wings. But we don't know, because the Muslim Brotherhood was slaughtered in 1982 in Hama in Syria. We don't know how strong they are inside the country or what their agenda is.
Other thoughts about Syria?
Well, I mean, like the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and so on, those behind the protests in Syria, those behind the Syrian revolution, have not been at first the Islamists. I think that's certainly the case all around, right? Even though it could be said that Islamists have benefited the most in these countries after the revolutions. I think we're not there yet, and we won't be there yet in Syria for quite some time with regard to the outcome of democratic elections and Islamists winning. And what that means is there's still a lot more tragedy and blood, I think, unfortunately, in the time to come with regard to Syria.
Meaning
The way to ensure, or the way to try to make sure that we don't get to an Iranian solution or other kinds of solutions is to agree ahead of time as to what the red lines are of a post-Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. And that is one in which all Syrians, whether they are Alawi or Christian or Druze or Sunni or Shia, are full citizens, have full citizenship rights, and are not excluded and are not made to pay the price for this Alawi regime. Of course, that's easier said than done, but that's one first step that I think is necessary to ensure that post-Bashar al-Assad Syria does not look like post-Saddam Hussein Iraq.
Do you see in your mind some period of chaos, unlike, say, the Egyptian example, where the dictator goes and not the next day, but you had some restoration of order relatively quickly. You don't see that for Syria. You don't see that as an option for Syria, a possibility.
Continuing chaos?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's definitely an option.
Or a likelihood.
Because there are so many factions, so many groups, and the Alawi, who are the minority there, 10, 12%, are not going to go down easily. And I don't know where they're going to retreat to. There's a theory they would go back to Latakia, which is their stronghold, but that really seems far-fetched. They're not going to go down easily. The Sunni factions, the weaker the Alawi get, the more they're going to fight. And I think it's going to be a real slugfest if we go down that route and Kofi Annan does not succeed in getting some kind of political process going.
Okay. I want to invite your questions now. I'd like to ask a couple of things as we get started. The first is when you ask a question when you're called on, if you wouldn't mind standing, saying your name so that we can get to know each other a little bit. The microphone will be placed in your hand so that people on the webcast can hear you. And the other thing I'd ask is please short, direct questions. We want to hear from as many of you as possible and hear the wisdom and the answers of our panel. You've had your hand up for a while, sir, and you're near a microphone, so go right ahead, please. You may be first.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Saeed Arikat. I have a quick question. It was suggested that this may be their last election. I want to ask about two groups and their future in the political map of the Middle East, and that is the secularist movement and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Thank you.
Your question is, I'm sorry, now we need a little...
Future.
Your question is about the future of those movements.
What role will the secular movements play in the future of the Middle East, and what role will Hezbollah play? I mean, we're talking about the ascendancy, basically, of the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni.
Okay, let's take them one at a time. What role will the secular movements play in the Middle East? That's the first question.
I think you have to go country by country. I mean, you take the Maghreb, particularly I'm talking about Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. The secularists have considerable force in the labor movements. There's still strong communist parties and socialist parties and Arab nationalist parties. Algeria has a labor party that's run by a Trotskyite, if you can believe that. In Tunisia, the labor union is 500,000 strong. That's a huge organization, and they're by and large secularists. So, in the Maghreb, I think that the secularists are far from being in the tiny minority, and they're going to play a big role in moderating the Islamists. When you get as you go east, then I leave it to my colleagues who are the Egyptians.
Big role for the secularists in Egypt, say?
I think that's exactly the problem. They're certainly powerful in state institutions. They're powerful, among intellectuals and so on. But if we're moving to an era of democratic and electoral politics, the question is how much organizational presence they have out in the society, and that's where they're extremely weak. You do see kind of the beginnings of a reawakened labor movement in Egypt, but other than that, there's no real organizational vitality that they have. And I would say the further east you go, the worse that problem gets.
Just a footnote, and to say, we have to be clear also that there are very few people in Egypt and in many other countries in the region that would describe themselves as secularists, right? And in fact, the word is not really used commonly and has a negative connotation with regard to it in Arabic. So they might be liberal, some of them aren't liberal, they're non-Islamists, But secular and so on with that meaning and might not be exactly the case. With regard to Hezbollah, one of the fascinating things that one witnesses is that if one looks at Hezbollah's standing in the Middle East, say 5-6 years ago, right after the July-August 2006 Hezbollah war with Israel, Hezbollah was a model. Hassan Nasrallah was the most popular political leader in the Arab world. The polling data showed that. And I remember being in Cairo during the war and seeing demonstrations in which liberals and Christians were holding up Hassan Nasrallah photos and so on in the demonstrations. This is in 2006, yeah. Of course, now Hezbollah's standing is very different in many countries because they are supporting the Assad regime. They've been criticized by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists in Egypt. And so their popularity has gone down significantly as a result of what we've seen with regard to Syria and what we've seen with regard to the other countries as well.
Let's go
But
back.
can
Go
I
ahead,
just say
Robert.
one thing about Hezbollah, which I find fascinating, that for the past 6 years, its partner in a political coalition has been a right-wing Christian group.
Right.
And that's been critical to make sure that both parties actually have a large influence in parliament. So that you even get a group that, like Hamas, these are the two groups that are both bullet and ballot. They haven't made the transition beyond, renouncing violence of any form, like most of them have, that has turned to another religion to actually bolster its political position.
Let's go to this side of the room. Actually, way in the back there, I see a hand but not a face. So, yes, you back there near the back. Go right ahead.
Thanks. Zach Gold from Brookings. I actually, kind of following on Dr. Shahada's point about Hezbollah, I noticed when we were talking about regional issues, the panel spoke only of Israel. And I was wondering, more importantly, these groups' relations with each other and the future of their states' relations with each other, and also, very importantly, with Iran. Thank you.
Go ahead. Thoughts?
I'll take the Iran question. I don't think that, look, this is where you get into the sectarian differences. And one of the striking things about the Islamists in the region is that there is no single party anywhere, Sunni or Shiite, that appeals to both as a mass movement. You may have the odd individual, but you don't find Sunni and Shia together. There is that intense rivalry that plays out even among Islamists. And Iran is a predominantly Shiite country, and most of the countries we've seen make through the transition are Sunni. And so, there's that very uneasy relationship. And I think also in the light of Iran's very controversial relationship, whether it's with its own people after the election in 2009 or with the international community over the nuclear program and other things, that no one's looking in Sunni Islamic politics at Iran as a model. And I don't even think that Hezbollah, at the end of the day, it talks about recognizing the fact that Lebanon has 17 or 18 recognized sects that have to be included in government. And so we kind of leap into, put them all in the same basket. And I just don't think that's true anymore.
Hasn't Egypt, since the revolution, made some moves toward Iran that were seen as conciliatory?
Improved diplomatic relations. Whoopee, whoopee. I mean, that doesn't mean that they're talking.
They don't even have them.
Right.
Right,
It's been
exactly.
quite the opposite, in fact. Yeah.
I'm not convinced that this is something that we in the West need to worry a lot about. It's not like, the Egyptians are going to try to get Iranian nuclear technology they have. I just don't see it. There are too many suspicions between.
The other part of the question, I believe, was relationship of Arab nations to each other. I mean, we know about Saudi Arabia and Syria being increasingly at loggerheads. What about the countries where there's been a change of government? Will they get along in the same way that they did?
Come on, guys. I mean,
well, there's been a concern. There's been a concern, of course, among the Gulf states with what happens the Arab Spring. Of course, I mean, to be quite blunt, Saudi Arabia has been leading the counter-revolution. It's been alleged, whether this is true or not, funding Islamist groups and other nefarious activities in a number of states to kind of thwart democracy, to make sure that the winds of democratic change don't blow across the Red Sea. We certainly know that they supported the Mubarak regime up until the very end, and were actually pressuring the United States not to put pressure on the Mubarak regime. And of course, Saudi Arabia has been concerned as to where Egypt goes afterwards, whether it goes towards Iran, which is not going to be the case, and so on. And the Egyptians are also concerned not to get on the wrong foot or have a bad relationship with Saudi Arabia for other reasons as well, because millions of Egyptians work there, because it's seen as a potential investor and is an investor in Egypt, and so on. So certainly Saudi Arabia has played a role in the Arab Spring, even if there was one protester there that day. And in fact, there was more than one. But they were Shia protesters in the eastern province, thousands of them, demanding full citizenship rights and not an end to discriminatory practices. So they've also witnessed an Arab Spring, and they've spent over $100 billion to try to buy off not citizens, but the residents of Saudi Arabia, so that they don't have the fate of Mubarak and Ben Ali and so on.
Just to add one thing on I asked both the founder of the Ennahda party in Tunisia and the member of parliament from Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt if they wanted to have closer relationships and create a kind of network. And they all said, well, we really think we should, because we're all going through similar experience, talk to each other more and so forth. But the thing that's so striking is that the whole idea of recreating a caliphate or a Muslim bloc or an Arab Muslim bloc is just not on the table. Nationalism, even in countries where they have been, that are less than 100 years old in terms of their modern borders or have only been independent since World War II, that there's really a sense of we are Tunisian, we are Egyptian, we are Libyan, and I think the nationalist identity in some ways is even as important or maybe even more important than their Islamic identity. That's something that I think is pretty new.
Can I just say something about the ties between them? Because this is something I've been very, very curious about. I mean, I think that's exactly right. These are movements that recognize each other as kind of friendly movements, and they'll say, watch what each other is doing very, very closely. And sometimes they'll plagiarize each other's slogans and this sort of thing, and they'll sometimes have meetings. But there's a very strong ethos among them that says, the Jordanians will say to the Iraqis, will say to the Egyptians, you know conditions in your country best, and they're very domestically focused right now. The challenges are economic, they're political reconstruction, so they're really focused on their domestic political scene. And when they do show up in each other's countries, Rashid al-Khanouchi from Tunis showed up in Cairo this past summer and started talking on Egyptian television about what he called the Anglo-Saxon model, by which he meant a public life that is infused with religion, but where government didn't play a particularly strong role. And of course, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is hearing this and saying, that sounds very nice for Tunisia. Now, please go back there and practice this. And so there's a very, very strong feeling of mutual deference among them that really makes them, I think, domestically focused.
And that's why it's wrong to think of these movements as branch movements, right? The Muslim Brotherhood office in Tunisia or Morocco and so on. That's not the case at all. They're not branches. They're not franchise.
There's no
outfits.
corporate headquarters.
There's no single corporate headquarters. And it might be the case that the Brotherhood was essential in founding the Brotherhood in Syria or in Palestine. But they've developed in unique contexts and dealt with very different situations, occupation or Alawi regime, whatever it might be. And right now they're very, very different entities, almost primarily focused on domestic politics in each of their places.
A few more questions. How about here in the front, the gentleman with the beard here? Go ahead and stand up so people can see you.
Knox Thames with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Two questions. First, there's been discussion of, in these constitutional processes, will they put Sharia into those provisions? But there's a lot of smaller things that can be done that can have an equally important or large impact on societies through family law, blasphemy law, criminal law. How do you see these movements engaging in that area, which can really shrink the space for civic discourse for the majority faith, but also have an impact for minorities? And secondly, and separately, the lessons from Algeria with their Arab Spring came 20 plus years ago. How are these movements, what are they taking from that?
Let me just, forgive me, let's just take one of those so that we can have time to get to other people who have questions here. But the question about something short of Sharia in a constitution, That's your question, right? Are there things that are happening or will happen in the political system that have the same effect?
I think those are the important things to look at because, in a sense, the Sharia provisions that exist in constitutions are usually so general and so detached from any idea of enforcement mechanisms that it really is like writing a preamble. It's really sloganeering. And the Islamist movements themselves have realized that. That's why Ennahda has backed off the Sharia provision. That's why the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt says we're fine with the existing language from the 71 Constitution. We don't need anything stronger than that. And what they've also realized is that, again, you go to the ballot box, they do well, so they can write ordinary legislation. So I think what we're going to see is kind of a steady political contest that takes place over really kind of mundane laws, piece by piece. And the whole focus on Sharia in the Constitution is simply a distraction.
Can I just point out one funny thing? The Prime Minister of Tunisia yesterday had a press conference, or kind of an economic conference, and he called on more Western tourists to come. And this is a guy who was in jail for 17 years. He's 11 in solitary confinement. I interviewed him last month. He has a prayer mark on his head. He's a devout Islamist. And they served all kinds of alcohol. I mean, this was that when it comes to implementing, there is a sensitivity. He also had reached out, and I had dinner with the head of the Jewish community in Tunisia, the president, and he had said he met several times with the prime minister to talk about minority issues, and because they wanted to make sure their rights were protected. So I think there is a sensitivity, and they know that the outside world is going to hold them to account.
David Ottaway.
I think you got to take it country. I mean, what happened in Kuwait in the last week was really interesting. They passed a blasphemy law, and the entire parliament and government voted for it. Any insult of any kind mentioning the prophet is death sentence. This is just this past week. So this issue of blasphemy, which also affects this poor Twitter guy in Saudi Arabia, who Kashgari, who put out on Twitter an imaginary conversation with the Prophet Muhammad, and saying, I like this about you, but I don't like that about you, and Well, the guy was forced to flee the country. He was caught in Malaysia and returned. The question is now in Saudi Arabia, what do you do with him? And there are 20,000 Islamists calling for his execution. Only 4,000 came out in his defense in the cyber world. And so I don't know what's going to happen to him, but you start with these blasphemy laws, and pretty soon it goes into no insulting the ruler, and then you start tightening up, and one thing leads to another. And I don't know how these new Islamic led governments are going to deal with these issues. But Kuwait dealt with it, from my point of view, in a very disturbing way.
Time for a couple more questions. Let's go Okay, let's go to a woman. Okay, that's fine. How about you right there? In the third row.
I don't meet
you're
the,
not.
I don't meet the stereotype.
Oh, you don't. I just saw long hair.
Forgive me.
I saw long hair. Ask your question. Okay.
Okay.
No, ask your question. My gosh.
Yes.
Forgive me. Would you like to change your name at this time?
All kinds of stereotypes are not good, and one of them, which hasn't been challenged, and I'm glad there has been some diversity on some substantive issues, but we're all faced with an issue of how to evaluate the information we're given, an epistemological question. And one thing that hasn't been challenged has been the ridiculing of the American national discussion, the one-sided painting of it as all anti-Islamic, all Muslim Brotherhood, paranoid, hysterical. That has gone unchallenged, and yet actually what I have heard from the panel, and particularly from the main speaker, has been what has been practically the unanimous line of the media, NPR, what I hear on network news, what I read in the Washington Post, which is that Islamism is not a threat. First it was that the Islamists couldn't possibly win elections, and then when they did, but the Muslim Brotherhoods are not a threat. So I think there's a gross misperception of what the national dialogue has been, and it seems to me there is an othering of the American people and of the national dialogue, which makes it hard to credit the information I'm given. That's a tough thing because I would like to get accurate information. and I'm wondering where I can go for that.
Well, you can't rely on me to accurately describe your gender. But other than that, so you were arguing that the debate is a little more rich than it seems, or you're arguing that people should be given a little more credit than they're being given. Is that would?
I don't know what the question was.
I'd say it's been so one-sided.
You think it's been a one-sided?
As if they were saying something that they're not.
Okay. All right. Okay.
It has become impossible to have a real dialogue.
Thank you. Okay. Thoughts about that?
You can't predict the outcome of what's going on because everything's in flux. So I think what's striking to a lot of people is that everybody thought these Islamists were going to be really hard-nosed and, Sharia tomorrow, et cetera. They're calming down. They have to deal with the realities. So I think what we're struck by, as an ex-journalist, still thinking like a journalist, what we're struck by is this coming out of Islamic parties and their confrontation with the reality and their stepping back from their own hardline positions. Now, is this going to change? We have to stay tuned. I don't know, and I can't give you an answer. But I think as a journalist, what we've been concentrating on is what we didn't expect to see, and this realization by the Islamists that, they got to govern, and it's a difficult job, and you can't necessarily maintain your most extreme or militant positions.
Let's go to, I'm going to go to you and then to Congresswoman Harman. Go right ahead, ma'am.
My name is Mushira Khattab. I am a scholar with the Woodrow Wilson. Do you allow me to make some input? Not a question. I just want to make some...
Very short on time.
Yeah, of course. As about the discussion you're talking about, the hysterical debate, it's not only here. Even back home, I come from Egypt. We have hysterical debate and fear from the Islamists. And as to the question, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis and who wants to appeal to the people by being more extremist or not, I think by not being extremist. And we would see now in the parliament, the Salafists, they have taken off their white galabiya and they're all wearing suits, they've trimmed their beards, and they started to talk about human rights. And as to the elections, once they win the election, it will be the last one. I don't think they dare do this now because they know they were not the ones who triggered the revolution, and they know that everyone is on the watch out. People have realized their weight. Now, to the outcome, I think the foreign policy will not change. The Muslim Brotherhood, neither the Salafis have said anything against Israel so far. They haven't said anything on Camp David. I think the Arab sensitivities is a fear, but eventually I cannot really tell. The U.S., there is a worry. If I were the U.S., I would worry about the declining popularity. The crux will be the economy. They are for a free market, it's true, but they will be faced by the subsidies and how to find money to continue what they were doing during the campaign. So the main concern is women's rights. So this will be the real challenge, the real concern. Women will suffer. Thank you.
So the point made there that there is what you describe as hysterical debate or over-concern about Islamists even in the countries affected. Jane Harman, please go right ahead.
I'm not sure whether I heard this or not. I don't think so. So it really is a question. I mean, I've observed for months that it's much better to have Islamists inside the tent, participating in parliaments, than outside trying to blow up the tent. And so my question is, what does all this mean for al-Qaeda and other groups that have no interest whatever in cooperating with elections, democracy, and governments?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that in the decade since 9/11, a lot of the Muslims, whatever their political feelings, feel that they have paid the biggest price from al-Qaeda, whether it's in life or the presence of foreign troops, disruption to their economic livelihoods and future, and that we've seen a growing disaffection with all the extremist ideologies. I think al-Qaeda is in many ways becoming a bit passé. It's not finished. It won't be finished for a long time. But when you see groups, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, the ones that have been the most militant or haven't made taken those final steps, trying to compromise within the political system, it's because they realized that it's only within the tent that they can get the things that they care about on daily life. And the fact that al-Qaeda hasn't been able to provide tangible answers on issues of jobs or education or housing, and that's the kind of good news. But again, because there's such a tendency to lump them still all together, anybody who's an Islamist is sympathetic to al-Qaeda, that we need to become more sophisticated in our own discourse. In the same way Egyptians are learning kind of the hard way and rather quickly, they have to understand the different political spectrum in their own place.
David Ottaway, did you have something to add to that?
No,
okay, let's get one or two more questions then if we can. Ma'am, way in the back corner there, go right ahead.
Renee Garfinkel, Danger Zone Radio and TV. And this is to the panel. Have you seen any support in the countries we're talking about for the fundamental issues that we in the West think are fundamental to democracy? Freedom of speech, you addressed that with blasphemy, freedom of the press, individual rights, freedom of religion. Is there any discussion or pressure for those fundamental individual freedoms?
An especially vivid issue in a place like Egypt with a large Christian minority, but every country has its minorities, within or without Islam. Go right ahead.
I would say absolutely very strongly. And that's an awful lot of what the uprisings of the last year have been about. I would say that when we factor the Islamists into the equation, what mainstream Islamist movements came to realize over the last 10 or 20 years or so is that they were, in a sense, a lot of the victims of the restrictions on these rights. That said, my own sense, be interested to hear from the other panelists on this, is that their conception of what those rights are very political in nature. So you have a right to publish a newspaper and say anything you want about political speech. You're certainly not free, however, to insult religion or insult religious truths. It certainly doesn't extend to things that are pornographic or even sexually risque. So it's a very political focus, but there's a very, very strong right focus that's just the currency of everyday politics in a lot of these places.
Kind of free as long as we do what we approve of.
Free within limits.
I would say the analogy I have is what they want is the America my father was born into, which banned alcohol, which banned commerce on Sundays, and that sort of thing, but which certainly allowed free political speech.
America, 1921. That's
he was born 1929.
1929. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Right here, ma'am. Go right ahead. Is this the person you were?
Yeah.
Yes, please go right ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Daphne McCurdy with the Project on Middle East Democracy. I wondered if the panelists could talk about the advantages and disadvantages of maintaining a separate social movement when these Islamist groups choose to enter politics. So, for example, in Egypt and Jordan, when the Muslim Brotherhood chose to enter politics, there was a separate political wing. But we see in Tunisia and Morocco that when Ennahda and PJD's predecessors chose to enter politics, they went full-fledged into politics. And in Turkey, actually, the AKP, you have members who are part of different religious movements, and that's actually causing conflict within the party now. So I just wondered if the panelists could speak to that.
I think that's a really fascinating issue, because one of the things that's happened out of the Arab Spring are the so-called youth movements. And they have to decide whether they're going into politics or not going into politics, and whether their space is going to be Tahrir Square and Avenue Bourguiba or through a political party. And a lot of them are maintaining their independence in Yemen, in Morocco, in the April 6th movement says and in Egypt says they're not going into politics, they're going to stay outside of politics. And to me, it's a really interesting factor because they can cause and put pressure on governments through demonstrations. And this is something totally new in the Arab world, these movements outside of political parties. And I think it's fascinating. I don't know where they're going, but they're maintaining their independence. And they're saying, you know, if we don't like what's going on, we're going to go and demonstrate. And now how the new parties are going to deal with them, I do not know.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of our question session. Wait. You're about to get a chance to buy this book by the thousands. But first, we have an obligation here, an opportunity to kind of get a lightning round from these folks. If I could just go right down the panel, and if you can give me one final thought, one bottom line for you. Robin Wright, you can go first.
Change takes a long time. 20 years after the demise of the Soviet Union, you still have a former communist in power who may be there till 2024. In South Africa, a generation later, from the day that Nelson Mandela walked to freedom, the average black is worse off than he was under apartheid. Change takes a long time, and that we shouldn't expect more from the Arab world just because of the drama of their uprisings than we expect from other parts of the world.
I'm sorry, I just don't have patience for that. David Ottaway.
I would say I think economics are going to be a determinant factor in how the outcome of these governments, because the economic situation is so serious in so many of these countries. And I think it's going to play a decisive role in what happens.
Okay, change takes a long time. It's the economy, stupid. Nathan Brown.
Okay. I go back to Robin's first point, that what we're used to looking at these movements as is we're used to looking at them through a security prism. And in these societies, it was the same thing. It's about terrorism, it's about war, and so on. And it's clear now that what they really represent is a sharp political challenge, and we have to view them much more domestically. They're a challenge to their political systems because they're so well organized as they go into elections, and in international terms, they have policy positions that don't always match up with the governments that they're replacing. So this isn't about war, and it's not about terrorism, but it is going to be a long-term political challenge for everybody.
It's about politics. Samar, you get the last word.
Well, they've said everything that I wanted to say, but I would make just 2 points, and they're both echoing things that have been said. The one is the issue of diversity, and I think this gets to the question that was asked. There are Islamists that we should be worried about who do want to limit women's rights and limit your personal freedoms, but they're a very diverse group, and there are many who are Democrats and so on. And then it's the economy, stupid. I think that's really the most important issue that will determine the outcome in places like Egypt and Tunisia in the next 5 years.
It may push them out of power.
Could very well do that.
Please join me in thanking our panel.